Harrison Ford was sitting in his beat-up Volkswagen van in the parking lot of Elstree Studios, tears streaming down his face, when he made the decision that would have changed movie history forever. It was May 23, 1976, and the man who would become Han Solo was about to walk away from acting and never look back. The keys were in his hand, the engine was running, and in 30 seconds he was going to drive away from the biggest opportunity of his life without knowing it. But then the phone rang. Not his phone. There were no cell phones in 1976. The phone call that would save Han Solo, rescue Harrison Ford's career, and create one of cinema's greatest legends came from an unexpected source, through a strange twist of fate that nobody could have predicted. What happened in the next 5 minutes didn't just change Harrison Ford's life, it changed the course of film history forever. To understand why Harrison Ford was ready to quit acting on that gray London afternoon, you need to know what had happened inside Stage 6 just 30 minutes earlier. The Star Wars set was chaos. George Lucas, then 32 years old and already drowning in the pressure of his ambitious space opera, had just witnessed what he thought was the worst acting performance he'd ever seen. Harrison Ford had been struggling with a particularly difficult scene where Han Solo confronts Darth Vader. Take after take, something wasn't clicking. Ford's delivery felt wooden, forced, nothing like the cocky smuggler Lucas had envisioned. The crew was getting restless. The budget was hemorrhaging money. And Lucas, never known for his patience with actors, finally snapped, "Cut! That's not working, Harrison." Ford stood there in his vest and boots, the iconic Han Solo costume that would one day be displayed in museums around the world. But in that moment, he felt like a fraud wearing it. "What do you want me to do differently?" Ford asked, his jaw tightening in that way it did when he was trying to contain his frustration. Lucas rubbed his temples. The young director was under enormous pressure from Fox executives who thought Star Wars was Lucas's expensive folly. Every day behind schedule brought the studio closer to shutting down production entirely. "I don't know, Harrison. Just be more Han Solo." "I don't know what that means," Ford replied, his voice getting quieter, a dangerous sign for anyone who knew him. "I'm doing exactly what you wrote on the page. The page isn't enough. I need you to find something else. Something cooler." It was the word cooler that broke something inside Harrison Ford that day. For 3 years, Ford had been grinding away as a carpenter, building cabinets and decks for Hollywood executives while auditioning for parts that went to actors with better connections or more traditional good looks. He'd come close to quitting acting a dozen times, but something always pulled him back. The hope that maybe, just maybe, he could make it work. Star Wars was supposed to be his break, not a huge break. Nobody expected the film to be more than a modest science fiction adventure, but steady work that would let him keep pursuing acting without having to swing a hammer every morning at dawn. But standing on that set, with Lucas looking at him like he was a problem to be solved rather than a collaborator, Ford realized he'd been fooling himself. He wasn't an actor. He was a carpenter who sometimes pretended to be other people. "Take 5, Lucas called out, turning away from Ford to discuss camera angles with the cinematographer. Ford walked off the set without a word. He made it to his van in the parking lot before the emotions hit him. 34 years old, married with 2 young kids, and he was crying in a parking lot because a filmmaker 12 years younger than him had essentially told him he wasn't good enough. But it wasn't just about Lucas's criticism. It was about everything. The years of rejection. The mornings spent building kitchens for people who wouldn't remember his name. The constant financial stress. The growing certainty that he was chasing something that was never going to happen. Ford pulled out the keys to his van and made a decision. He was done. He would drive home to Los Angeles, pick up his tools, and go back to being a full-time carpenter. It was honest work, good work, and he was excellent at it. He started the engine, but before he could put the van in drive, there was a knock on his window. Ford looked up, expecting to see a security guard telling him to move along. Instead, he saw Alec Guinness, the distinguished British actor who was playing Obi-Wan Kenobi. Guinness was already a legend at that point. He'd won an Oscar for The Bridge on the River Kwai. He was everything Ford wasn't, classically trained, respected, secure in his place in the profession. Ford rolled down the window, quickly wiping his eyes. "Having a rough go of it?" Guinness asked, his voice carrying that gentle authority that would make Obi-Wan so memorable. "Just heading home," Ford said. Guinness studied him for a moment. "You know, I've been watching you work. You have something most actors spend their entire careers trying to find." Ford laughed bitterly. Yeah? What's that? Authenticity. You don't act like Han Solo. You inhabit him. There's a difference. Lucas doesn't seem to think so. Guinness leaned against the van. George is brilliant, but he's not an actor. He sees the character on the page, but he doesn't understand how a character lives and breathes through a person. You do. Ford felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But it was the absence of the crushing despair he'd felt moments before. The scene we just did, Guinness continued, the one George wasn't happy with. I've done thousands of scenes in my career. That was real. That was a person being vulnerable while trying to appear strong. It was beautiful work. Then why? Because George is scared. This film means everything to him, and he's terrified it won't work. When people are scared, they sometimes mistake caution for wisdom. Guinness paused, studying Ford's face. Don't quit. Not today. Not because of this. Ford turned off the engine. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't drive away right now. Because, Guinness said with a slight smile, someone needs to answer that phone. Ford was confused for a second, then heard it, a phone ringing in the distance, coming from the direction of the production offices. That could be for anyone, Ford said. Could be, Guinness agreed, but I have a feeling it's for you. What neither Ford nor Guinness knew was that at that exact moment, George Lucas was in his office having the worst day of his directing career. The scene with Ford had been a disaster, but it wasn't Ford's fault, it was Lucas's. The director had realized about an hour too late that he'd been giving Ford contradictory directions and then blaming him when the result was confused. Lucas was staring at the phone on his desk, working up the courage to call Ford's agent and have him replaced. He'd already mentally started going through other actors who might be available on short notice. But then his assistant knocked on the door. George, there's a phone call for you. It's Francis Coppola. Francis Ford Coppola wasn't just Lucas's friend and mentor. He was the most powerful filmmaker in Hollywood in 1976. Fresh off The Godfather Part 2, Coppola was the one person whose opinion could genuinely influence the future of Star Wars. Francis? What's up? George, I'm calling about your Han Solo. Harrison Ford. Lucas felt his stomach drop. Word traveled fast in Hollywood. If Coppola had already heard about the problems on set, what about him? I just got off the phone with Steven Spielberg. He's been asking around about Ford for a film he's putting together. Adventure picture. Apparently Ford auditioned for Steven a few months ago and made quite an impression. Lucas was quiet for a moment. Steven Spielberg, even then, was Hollywood royalty. If Spielberg was interested in Ford, Steven wanted to know if Ford was tied up with your space picture for long. I told him Ford was your Han Solo, and Steven got very excited. Said Ford had exactly the kind of presence he was looking for. Masculine, but vulnerable. Tough, but with a sense of humor. Coppola paused. George, I don't know what your experience with Ford has been, but Steven thinks he could be a major star, and Steven doesn't say that about many people. Lucas sat in silence, processing this information. Steven Spielberg, who could have any actor in Hollywood, was specifically interested in Harrison Ford. Francis, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Do you think I'm good with actors? Coppola laughed. George, you're many things. You're a visionary. You're a technological pioneer. You're going to change how movies are made. But directing actors, that's not your strongest suit. So, if an actor isn't giving me what I want, it might be because you're not giving him what he needs. Have you talked to Ford? Really talked to him? About the character? About what you're looking for? Lucas realized with a sinking feeling that he hadn't. He'd been so focused on the technical aspects of filming, the effects, the editing, the sheer logistics of making Star Wars, that he'd treated the actors like another piece of equipment, to be managed rather than collaborators to be guided. I think I may have made a mistake, Lucas said quietly. Mistakes can be fixed, George, but only if you fix them today, not tomorrow, today. After hanging up with Coppola, Lucas sat in his office for several minutes, thinking. Then he picked up the phone again and dialed the extension for the assistant directors. Is Harrison Ford still on the lot? I think so. Last I saw, he was heading toward the parking lot. Find him, tell him I need to see him in my office, and tell him it's important. 20 minutes later, Harrison Ford was sitting across from George Lucas in a conversation that would change both their lives. Harrison, I owe you an apology. Ford was surprised. He'd expected to be fired, not apologized to. I've been directing you like you were a special effect instead of an actor. That's not fair to you, and it's not fair to Han Solo." Lucas leaned forward. "Tell me about Han Solo. Not what I wrote on the page. Tell me who you think he is." For the first time since he'd arrived in London, Ford felt like someone was actually listening to him. He's someone who's been let down a lot, so he acts like he doesn't care about anything, because caring hurts. But underneath all that attitude, he's desperate to find something worth caring about. Lucas nodded slowly. "And how does that feel to play?" "Familiar," Ford said quietly. It was the first completely honest thing Ford had said since arriving on the Star Wars set, and Lucas recognized the truth in it immediately. "The scene we shot today, the one that didn't work." Let's talk about what Han is really feeling in that moment. For the next hour, Lucas and Ford dissected the scene, the character, and the emotional truth of every moment. When they were finished, Ford understood Han Solo in a way he never had before. And Lucas understood that he'd been working with a real actor all along. He just hadn't known how to unlock his potential. "Want to try the scene again?" Lucas asked. They returned to the set, and Ford delivered the scene that would become the template for Han Solo's character throughout the entire Star Wars saga. It was cocky and vulnerable, tough and funny, exactly what Lucas had been looking for but hadn't known how to ask for. When they finished filming, the entire crew burst into applause. That night, Ford called his wife from his hotel room. "How did it go today?" she asked. "I think," Ford said, "I might actually be an actor." What Ford didn't know was that Steven Spielberg's inquiry about his availability wasn't just casual interest. Spielberg was casting the lead role in an adventure film called Raiders of the Lost Ark. The phone call from Francis Coppola hadn't just saved Han Solo, it had set in motion the events that would make Harrison Ford Indiana Jones as well. But even more than that, the conversation between Lucas and Ford changed how both men approached their work. Lucas learned to collaborate with actors instead of just directing them. Ford learned to trust his instincts and find the emotional truth in even the most fantastical characters. The scene they reshot that day, Han Solo's first confrontation with Darth Vader, became one of the most iconic moments in Star Wars. But more importantly, it was the moment Harrison Ford stopped being a carpenter who sometimes acted and became an actor who happened to have once been a carpenter. Years later, after Ford had become one of the biggest stars in the world, a journalist asked him about that day on the Star Wars set. "I learned something important," Ford said. "Sometimes the thing that feels like failure is actually just the moment before breakthrough. The trick is not quitting 30 seconds too soon." The phone call from Francis Coppola saved Han Solo. But it was Harrison Ford's willingness to walk back into that room, to try one more time, to be vulnerable enough to tell the truth about what he was feeling. That's what saved Harrison Ford. Sometimes the most important phone calls are the ones that remind you who you really are. Harrison Ford almost quit acting forever on May 23, 1976. Instead, he became a legend. And it all started with a phone call that changed everything.